Okay, I received a request to discuss edges on artifacts and what kinds of edges there are, how you make them, what are they used for, what are they called, etc., etc. Okay, so I'm going to try to explain edges with words. Okay, it always makes me laugh. Uh, let's see. This is going to be hard. This is going to be very hard because this area of study is still new, and I don't know everything about this area of study. What I primarily know is projectile points. I mean, true projectile points, mainly true arrow points. That's what I have been studying mostly because that's what I started need. When I started making archery equipment, I needed stone points for arrows. So that's what my initial focus was, and it still is. I'm branching out into other things, but the point is, we're looking at, or the questions are, what kind of edges do we have on these things? And a lot of new guys don't understand terminology as far as edge work goes and how to sharpen points. Not only the terminology, but actual procedures and what's the difference between this edge and that edge. It's complicated. The simplest answer is just it's very complicated. From what we do know about projectile points, true projectile points, is that their edges are variable. That's the first thing to keep in mind. Variability. One culture's arrowheads, true arrow points, we're talking about true arrow points, are different from another culture's arrow points, both in the edge profile, the way they look, and in the sharpness. But I'm going to generalize it. I'm going to just very briefly discuss the main objective of edges on projectile points is sharpness. Okay? And maybe a secondary thing is pain inducing. Okay, now this area here is more difficult to explain than this area here. A lot of projectile points exhibit strange characteristics, right? Like pronounced barbs, serrations, and different things in areas where you wouldn't expect them. Let me just draw this out so we know what we're talking about, right? Why put these serrations and stuff that are very pronounced in the sides when you know that they're going to resist penetration? And why put barbs when you know that they can easily break off and contaminate the meat, or they are very weak and they don't really lend themselves to being used repeatedly, right? They're just one-shot deals. And I think it has to do with pain, and it could also have to do with bleeding out faster. But these kind of experiments are not ethical. Okay, so I can't really discuss this, although this may be a huge part of why certain edges are made a certain way. I'm going to be discussing this here, the sharpness of the edges. Okay, so this, we all know that the stone edges will cause bleeding, but we're talking about excessive or over and beyond what a normal edge would do. Okay, so I won't discuss this part here. So sharpness, what you want, if I look at the side, kind of like a cross section, most bifaces look like that, right? So we're going to zoom in on this here, so it looks like this, but rarely do edges actually look like this. If you look closely at artifacts, they look more like this, where you have these little scoop outs And these are bulbs of force, or bulbs of percussion, or bulbs of pressure that form these scoop outs. Okay, sometimes you will see this kind of thing on a very how do I say, I would say it's excessively picked at, or excessively picked or retouched. Almost like in preparation for driving more flakes. Okay, when you have an excessively picked edge or retouched edge, you get this effect, but this is not common. Mostly you get this effect here, where the bulbs of force are utilized to create a thin area, and from the side of the projectile point, that edge is going to be wavy, like that, right? To where, you know, you put, these are flakes that have been popped out. You pop it out and you have a little bit of a rise on the edge when you push out a flake. This edge will rise. It's like turning the edge, you know what I mean? So you get these undulations. The same thing on the other side when you pop out a flake. It's a lowering here in this case. You pop these out. So you get this undulating or serpentine or wavy edge. When you're looking at the side, but looking at the cross section, it looks like this. Okay. Modern points tend to look like this, where it's excessively picked or retouched. The ancient ones look more like this, where they utilize the bulbs of force or bulbs of pressure to their advantage. Now you can use it in two ways. You can do it this way, or you can bevel it. So from the side, this is a beveled edge, where this bulb of force is only on one side. If you zoom in closer, it looks more like this. There's a very sharp lip there, and then it dives quickly, and then the other side, the other surface. You can control this bulb to look more like this one here, right? But some have a steep bevel, some have a not so steep bevel. This type of bevel is usually for the larger points. And this is for the smaller points. The smaller points are more refined like this, to create a much more delicate edge. The larger points tend to be like this because this area is sufficient for cutting on a larger point. So this edge is very similar to this one here. When you look at it, comparatively speaking, this is sufficient to do cutting, especially on skinning or opening a hide or whatever, on a larger point. Okay, so but I won't get into that. I think you get the idea. This particular side profile is what we're looking at with ancient artifacts in most cases that I can put my finger on. And then there's also the beveled edge. Okay, so it's either bifacially, this is bifacial, and it can also be beveled, unifacially beveled or whatever. There's also the natural edge too, but we won't discuss the natural edges. Excuse me. Okay, so there's edge treatments. If you look at just the top view of an artifact, most of them are like that, pretty simple. But then you have some that have multiple notches. They can be symmetrical like this or asymmetrical. They could alternate in different ways. You can have more on one side than the other. Or you can have them actually zigzagging. So it looks like a zigzag. It doesn't have to be symmetrical. A lot of times they'll be small at the top and then they'll get bigger as they go down. You know what I mean? Same thing with serrations. Serrations can be simple, just random, like this. Very uneven, very uneven sometimes. They can be very regular, where there's little pop-out serrations. I don't know if that's so correct or a useful term. Projecting serrations like this with a consistent edge. They can, let's see what else. There can be serrations with serrations within them. These little areas between are actually serrated too. Or they can be just popped out, you know, regular pop outs. There's a lot of variation in these edges when looking at the top view of the point itself. Okay, so this is not as important when discussing edge quality as this here. The bifacial scooping out of the material, or the unifacial or beveled edge scooping out of the material to produce sharpness. Okay, that's what we're going after, sharpness. So in general, when I say that I try to get my edges to look more like an artifact, I'm using this analogy here. Most modern edges look like this, where it's very regular. Okay. So I think I could go into it further, and I tried to explain this. This is already the third video I've tried to do this with. So I'm just going to keep it simple and stop here. And I'll expand more as I bring out some more. I actually have more artifacts. I'll bring out some more, discuss the edges more in depth, and then try to expand on this. And then get more into what they call use-wear analysis. Okay. If I go into all the uses, like projectile points, saws, drills, gravers, scrapers, all these different types of tools with their respective edges. I could write a whole book. This could be 1,000 pages easy. Just on this. Just on the different edges for these different things. Because you would have to explain every variation. And within every variation, what is the side profile of every variation? Because it does vary. I know that sounds like doublespeak, but I think you're getting the idea. The simple answer to this is one man's saw could be the other man's scraper. One man's projectile point could be someone else's saw. One man's projectile point could also be his knife. It's the same thing. He doesn't make any distinction. And some cultures make distinctions. Some cultures make distinctions and there's no distinction in the edge. Some cultures make the distinction and there is a distinction in the edge. And blah, blah, blah. There's many, many different combinations of things. Luckily, I've been gifted a set of artifacts from one site. And this set of artifacts includes all of these. I have artifacts that are saws, or look like saws, drills, gravers, scrapers, knives, and projectile points, all in the same collection. So that would take me a while to go over, but I think I'll probably bring some of those out just to give you an idea of what they look like later on in future videos. Okay. All right, so I think that's it. Hope that helps.